tenho muitos argumentos para não falar português, argumentos estéticos e argumentos intelectuais. Particularmente pois que tem colegas que falam português mais tarde e que falam muito bem. For all these very serious reasons, I hope you forgive me for using English.
It's okay.
And I'm going to adapt my schedule a bit to the difficulties you had in order to start our machines. I'm going to deal with the topic that apparently is extremely different from the topic dealt with by the next speaker. I'm convinced this is not true at all. And I try to indicate links between this, and I hope that in the discussion you will help us watching these links and look for them. My general issue is something very abstract, and Bertoncilli will talk about very, I would not say down-to-earth questions, but about very problems from the very everyday situation of translation in a given culture. Let's take this one and not English as they always do. So what kind of link is it? So we try to move from very general topics into very particular ones, and I'm sure that there are lots of very particular topics underlying my discussion, and that there are very abstract questions underlying the discussion by Bertoncilli. Up to you and up to us to play with these relationships. I try to justify my title, and then I try to indicate what my discussion will be, and I don't think I'm very dogmatic in most of my behavior, not even as a professor, but for making clear what I try to support, I'll be rather dogmatic by saying I support this, that, that. These are my positions. And on the screen, so from time to time, I'll play a little bit with the information I have gathered. And suppose you need any written or printed document about that, I need to jump and so on. One of the advantages of the contemporary world being that communication sometimes is possible. My ambitions are not limited. I mean that everything we do in relation with translation depends on something like translation culture. The concept is not really used in the scholarly bibliography. I think I developed it. Okay. Translation culture. In fact, I'll explain, but I mean that translation is certainly not a mechanical phenomenon. It has lots of mechanical features, but if we do not know where, when, why, and so on, we do not know much. Translation culture. You all are part of a given translation culture. I mean something like a collective awareness of information, experiences linked with translation phenomena, and to a large extent this is even a little bit unconscious, and sometimes it becomes conscious, certainly here, but not with your neighbor, who after all watches the same movie as you do on the screen. Okay. Translation culture, I mean, there's some experience, and an experience that has been little by little established, even institutionalized, So I'll come back to it. I want to make clear that this is a very important cultural phenomenon in any community, certainly nowadays, more than before. Translation culture. From the beginning, it's clear that such a concept implies that almost everything linked with translation is part of cultural phenomena. And culture, after all, what do we mean by that? I could give you lists of definitions and lists of definitions about culture from many disciplines. So what do we mean exactly? But one thing is sure, translation obviously is part of the everyday dynamics of cultural phenomena. It's part of culture. It's part of culture, it's part of history. Is that the same thing? History, culture? And what do we mean by history? Now, part of my main argument is I try to show that when we talk about the history of translation as academics, as potential or real researchers, we need to add something. There's no history like that. From the moment we produce historical reactions, comments, questions, analysis, articles, books, we are into historiography. These are very different things. I could add something else that you all also would expect, that is translation theory. So what has it to do with theory? That's all. So I try to come up to that. But when dealing with translation historiography, that's my main thing. I want to stress that we need historiography if we want to produce research on translation. And even in order to be able to understand how translation works in our contemporary situation as scholars, we need translation historiography as part of research on translation. Now, is this really that new? It's not for saying things that have not been said. It's because translation in our society, I tried to drop a few sentences that indicate that translation in our society is so important and so much more important than what our leaders of society believe it is. It's clear that leadership is in great need of insights about international communication and interaction. And if they continue being so, I would say, uncivilized in matters of multilingual communication and translation, it will have very negative consequences for the way they manage society. But I'm not here for dealing with management. I'm speaking as a scholar. Translation culture. You use the word culture in a similar way in your everyday life from time to time. So you speak about people who have a certain level of, say, refinements or civilization or whatever it means. They are familiar with a given kind of topics, and even blindly they know how to behave in a given situation. In fact, partly it's not that different from some work that you may know from scholarship like Bourdieu, this concept of habitus. So after all, at least here, we deal with people who are so much involved in matters of translation that it has become part of their daily life, of their habits. they get into their habits. And after all, it even means, so it's something like part of the routine expertise of not only the individuals, but of a given collectivity. It even means that it has been partly institutionalized. So I'm just trying to play with that idea because I'm convinced that it means something about the behavior of contemporary societies, even about this society, about any society. So you have people who know if, let's say, given ladies who like fashion and so on, you know, if you have this kind of shoes, well, then you don't wear, I don't know what, a given kind of earrings with that. So I don't have that culture. But there are people who are familiar with it. So the idea of being familiar, it implies a certain degree of unconsciousness. Now, why is this important for all of us? Because it indicates how we might distinguish between societies where this kind of experience and this kind of culture is, say, well established, and other societies where it is less established. You forgive me, I don't want to be naughty, but I'm very glad to be in the good company of Bertolt Zilli, who represents for me, he's a translator, he comes from Germany. I have worked a lot in my, say, in my younger years, that's quite a long time ago, on German culture. Now I try to show what this means. It's not really about Bertolt, it's a bit about Bertolt Zilli. The idea of translation, 1.5 centuries before Germany existed as a country, the idea of translation was one of the holy ideas of the intellectual elite speaking Germany. I don't know where exactly on the, what people would call now the German territory, that's a delicate concept. But it's very clear that the making of German culture was linked with the relationship with other cultures. And this was linked very directly, in a privileged way, with all kinds of interaction with other cultures. And the most explicit formulation of that awareness was the idea of world literature. It's interesting to see that the view on society was linked with literature, which normally nowadays would be problematic, and that it was developed by, well, even the concept of writing didn't really exist at that moment. And it was so explicit, I'll come back to that in the examples that I'm going to give. It was so explicit that it was even produced by, of course, we know that Weltliteratur is a concept developed by Goethe, and that he had a few masters with very big names and so on. And that this idea was not only represented by Goethe, but almost all writers with a good reputation around Goethe produced translations, but they wrote on translation, and they had a very explicit idea about translation, and it was even used as, now you will listen and you will see, maybe you find back already some features that you know from your own culture. It was used in Germany as one of the antagonistic arguments against the dominant culture from that moment and the dominant language, and even more technically against the dominant translation culture that was known all over Europe, the French one. So the German translation culture, no one used the word, but there was something like an unconscious awareness of some priorities. As soon as you deal with cultures and different cultures, and canonization of that idea was in fact the idea of becoming a nation, and linking that with the integration of the production from, say, books, language, cultural events, whatever, coming from anywhere. Like a summa cum laude literaria of the new model of a nation. Of course, you all know that, well, some people have said that this has had some disastrous effects afterwards, but the idea was there, and this was the model. Now, a translation culture, I mean, what I want to indicate further on is that it's full of translation cultures on the globe through the history of mankind. And it's not always linked with nations. For instance, religion through the ages would not exist without a given kind of translation culture. My real thesis, and then I'll jump into the next step, my real thesis is that if universities claiming to deal with the question of culture, societies, what do they call that? Nations. Nations are in competition with other kinds of communities. But in fact, other kinds of communities are as much linked with translation culture as, say, national cultures. The national cultures are very young, after all. Contemporary business culture works with the same mechanisms. But I'll leave that, but I'm working a lot on the question of the internationalization of community models, communities of practice. It has a lot to do with language. Now, one of my disciples has written a wonderful phrase, a wonderful sentence. The link between language and community, according to some among the greatest historians that we seem to know, the link between language and community is, I mean, the institutionalization, the idea of a national language is a very young phenomenon in the history of mankind. It's the result of certain kind of Western habits. It has spread out like a colonial model around the globe. It's clear that this was part of an internationalization movement. Nowadays, due to the development of translation studies, we know how multilingualism cannot work in any society without, well, say without lingua franca. You cannot understand lingua franca if you don't deal with translation, and vice versa. Now I come back to my disciple René Neylaerts, who wrote, there is no language policy without a translation policy. This is very important. Why? Because not only because of the language policy, but because the translation policy is almost always, well, no, is very systematically kept, not always under the waterline. It's not identified. You can identify, there are lots of techniques, if and only if you have and make use of research. One of the most important arguments in favor of research on languages. According to the experts in the contemporary business world nowadays, it's clear that multilingualism and translation, whatever business people in general tend to say, whatever even our rectors say about this, and our ministers, multilingualism and translation are added value. It means it gives privileges to those who master languages, translation, who can organize it. This means that the question of translation culture, of course, it's interesting for the history of mankind, but it's much more than that. It's also not only a diplomatic weapon, it's an economic, a political, it's a power weapon. And as long as scholars don't invest into this matter, they don't really do their job seriously, and they even cheat interdisciplinary research. So I don't see how universities can keep supporting internationalization without, I don't speak either in favor of the lingua franca nor against the lingua franca, but if this option for a given approach to languages is not supported by research, our intellectual leaders cheat the people that they claim to represent. I told you I'm going to be dogmatic, so I give you, these are theses, in fact these are hypotheses, but they are linked with research. Now I try to get into the more technical part of my game. Translation is historical. I'm sure we don't need to tell you why. You probably know all these theoretical explanations about who is the translator, for whom he's writing or speaking. Even in the history of mankind, it's clear that interpreting was institutionalized before translation was institutionalized. Again, the Germans have told us, Dolmetscher und Dolmetschen in the German culture refers to activities from the Middle East, which indicate very clearly that the Middle East was one of the key areas in the interaction between different worlds, and so on. The institutionalization of these activities has taken place earlier in the area of the interpreters. It has taken, and it's even clear up to our contemporary situation that our society doesn't really know how, well, no, they cheat us, and scholars accept to be cheated because they have not studied this. There's a whole question of the distribution of the terminology referring to the person who translates. So many people who produce subtitling on television, they will not accept to be treated as translators, they are subtitles. And the people who get into localization, they say, no, I'm a specialist in localization and all that kind of stuff. So there's no standard. Now it's clear that this has a lot to do with this. So it's about power and money. Universities, linguistics, even translation studies hardly have the keys to, I would say, the complexity of these games on behalf of culture in order to clarify how international communication works. One of my colleagues complains, he's an expert, a great expert in the area of media translation. He says, well, people publish a lot on media translation, but after all, what do we know about the rules of the game? Not much. people publish so much about the last version of a given movie because it was popular and so on. So the researchers don't go for the rules of the game. In fact, you can apply that to the entire world of translation. Our researchers are not really, they are part of kind of an inbreeding. They are happy to show that they know the tricks in the last movie or in the last novel and so on. But after all, we don't address, neither our colleagues from sociology. Nowadays, sociology invests a lot in translation. We don't address the people in organization studies. They know better about translations when they approach it than we do. So they go for more fundamental questions. So to the extent that translation studies nowadays is becoming a recognized area of academic research, what is lacking is good academic interdisciplinary cooperation. The whole question of translation culture, translation history, which for me is not very different, it's all linked with that. Now I try to get into the more particular implications of that, and I try to show at the end that in fact I'm, of course, for didactic reasons, I'm exaggerating, because we need to convince our colleagues that something has to change in the priorities of our planning. So there is interesting research of that kind. Even there's a lot of interesting, very new research from very different areas and very different cultures. So I try to show you that. That's one of the reasons why I have collected some material. Now I'll sit down a little bit and I try to get into what I call the more technical aspects of our issue.
Recording.
Okay. As almost everyone here, I have a past. My past was linked with literary studies. I discussed a lot with my colleagues about historiography in the area of literature, literary studies. And I did really convince them about my point, that is that most work in literary history was not really scholarship focused. I think lots among the arguments used there apply to the many books that you know and that may try to develop insights about the history of translation as a historiographical discourse. It's simple. I don't believe that there is a possibility of summarizing the history of translation, not even in one single country and even in one province, in one book. From the moment you transform that into something like a book, you produce a narrative. The first priority in these situations is, well, you need to establish links between various moments, and of course in history it's full of links between various moments. Now, in most literary histories and in most historical explanations about translation, in general it's more sophisticated, it's clear that the number of analyses of the possible relationships between one given phenomenon and another one, in general they try to shorten the story, and very often they try to make a good story out of the book. Historiography and books to be published and articles to be published, well, that's a matter of diplomatic relationships. I understand, there's no problem. One of the first books that claimed to offer the history of translation was written by a famous translator, and I'm sure he was a remarkable translator. He even happened to be Belgian, well, no shame upon him. The History of Translation by Henri Van Hoof, one book. How can you do this? Okay, it's an interesting book. So there's no problem. The ambition to, I'm even sure that this book is useful for scholarly interpretations. The problem is where, and you have to check, but in scholarship you always have to check. I know a similar enterprise by another individual. Oh, there are so many, but by Hans Vermeer, famous German translation scholar, theoretician, mainly involved with translation didactics, with an incredibly rich culture. It's a very impressive book, in several volumes. But the first ambition to summarize it, now there is no shame on it, not at all, it's a remarkable book. But you can't say this represents the history of translation. So there's so much more. In fact, the history of translation has been promoted, I say promoted, as one of the important chapters in the program of the new discipline called translation studies by the first people who made explicit such a program. Now maybe sooner or later people will say, okay, for this and that reason that's not satisfactory. Of course they have been this already. But the first models of such a program were developed by James Holmes, then in the second movement, rather soon after that, by Gideon Toury, and through his full career and so on. Now the question of history or historiography, they don't worry about this distinction. This was part of their planning. This is very important. So what kind of relationship is there between historiography and theory? At least part of the answer is in Toury's main idea about research on translation, that is that before, so his first idea was we have no translation theory. We have many translation theories, but they don't help us much, because in general they refer to translation that don't exist, that we still have to make. They are normative. They talk about the things we should do or have done, even when we talk about Julius Caesar and so on. So what Julius Caesar and his contemporaries should have done. So after all, I'm not sure this makes much sense. That was his conclusion. But so his conclusion was what we need is, in the terminology used then and so on, descriptive translation study. It means we have to, now I put it in my terms, we have to run through cultural situations, we have to map and to examine before we try to indicate which are the rules of the game. So one does not go without the other, that's all. So you cannot produce any systematic translation theories If the goal of research is to produce theories, I think partly it is. But it needs to be linked with the interaction with history and so on. These are the general situation. Now, has this been done? Of course this has been done. Now I try to run a little bit through various kinds of options. One of the conclusions will be research on translation, probably research on anything, cannot be individual. We need to plan and to work together. How can you deal with translation phenomena, which by definition are historical and cultural? How can you deal with this without making use of things done by other people? Of course you have to check, to counter-check, and so on. Now, I try to show what, from this kind of, there are lots of other recommendations, what seems to function and what does not seem to function. We all know the kind of historiography that has been produced and is being produced by people who say, well, I give you lots of data and so on. The factual history, factual and history and historiography. So important. So we need to record in a given area, indicating well which area, what is actually part of our observation. Things have changed in the history of research for very simple reasons, and we don't make well use of this. That is due to the development of electronic knowledge and techniques. Nowadays we have so many factual data in our computer without making use of them, not only because the electricity is cut off, but also because we are blind. So the use of electronic information, I'll show you in a while how some people from sociology make so much better use of the new technology of information in the area of translation. So many people continue as if nothing happened in so many other areas. Historiography that would simply go for isolated phenomena, or that would simply go for bibliographical repertoires. We can go without them. It's never sufficient. So we need more. So we need questions. Research is nothing else than questions solved. Where do your questions come from, and so on. I'm going to talk in the few minutes that are left about one of the books produced in my university about an electronic bibliography, very sophisticated one, about say 35 years in the 19th century of the French book history. There's a remarkable review by Anthony Pym in Target, it's all here. And one of his questions was, it's a very beautiful, otherwise I would not show it, of course. It's a very positive review. But he says, after all, why do you reduce your research to France? And he's right. So why is historical research and any research on translation so much linked with the national distinction lines? Internationalization exists since Julius Caesar and since the Garden of Eden. Otherwise we would have no religion. So why are historiographical works so heavily linked with national work? I know why. Because universities and researchers depend on national money and so on. there are lots of other capital. Very often, well, we cannot dream about any history of translation, say, in Europe, nor in Brazil. No? So how can we summarize anything? How can we produce macroscopic historical works? I'm going to show that it is possible. It is possible, depends. We need to have a good panoramic view, and we need to know what we select, and we need to know what we do not select, and we need to know how to combine them. So nowadays this is possible. It's not easy. It's remarkable how very isolated scholars have done this in recent years and are doing this and at a fast rhythm. So in a rather mechanical way for a long time, and of course not only because translation studies was like this, but they copied methods from the neighbor disciplines. Well, there are lots of shortcomings in traditional historiography. I started by this question about the willingness of an individual historian to explain phenomena when information is lacking and when you cannot check and so on. So you need collective work, and of course you can never trust even your best friends who are excellent colleagues by definition. So this coordination, so it means that research in the humanities, and certainly in matters of international communication, including translation, need to be taken seriously by our managers. And not simply because they do this for medicine and for business. It's because it's about research, and it's important research, and very clear nowadays that people from medicine and economics who say, well, the language question is for the people from the language departments. This is just abuse of power, nothing else. So the question of international communication, including translation, is a matter of strategy. But okay, I've told you this. So shortcomings of traditional history. Okay, I don't want to say that the examples of contemporary historiography are examples of sacred and perfect research. No, I'm going to indicate where there are obvious shortcomings. But if the community of researchers works well, it indicates what has to be done. So what can be done and what can be planned with the new kind of scholarly organization that is being worked out and works out rather well. There is a good bibliography. There are good bibliographies. I'm going to show them. I hope you know them and you make use of them. So it implies that we need to to be part ourselves of one community of translation culture. If we claim to represent university, it means that when we want to talk about translation, everything is allowed, but from the moment we claim to talk as scholars, we need to respect the rules of scholarship. And at that moment, it means that we cannot ignore the relevant tools and the best tools. So we are part of that translation culture that is approaching translation phenomena as part of the cultural dynamics, and that feel responsible for their so-called scholarly discourse. Now, just to show you that these things are serious and that they work and that we are not just talking about la pluie et le beau temps, as they say in French. So I can indicate that there are very new and very important initiatives that, and even already several years ago, and that tried to produce research on translation, and I would call it historiographical research, with the shortcomings from the moment and so on. Now, the final conclusion should be, well, why do you wait, or why don't you take part in the game? But now I'll try to show a few things. Now, I start with a rather recent example, and you probably know it. I'm sure that several among you know the book, one single book published in 1999 in France, and I would not say I'm fascinated by it or I'm irritated. It's a very important book, and it's dealing with literature, world literature. Not along the Goethe lines, but after all, it means that a few centuries after Goethe, one single scholar started up discussing the idea of world literature again. What an ambition. It's a lady, and she has such a beautiful name, Pascal Le Casanova. The book is entitled, you probably know it and you understand it in French, La République mondiale des lettres. It has been translated, I'm sure several of you have read it, either in Spanish.
Yeah. República Mundial das Letras.
Yeah. I don't want to insist too much on the book. One of the basic shortcomings I find in that book is it's full of statistical material, which indicates that she's a good sociologist from the Bourdieu tradition. But she produces mainly statistics on, say, on translation, very international statistics. She hardly produces any statistical document on the lingua franca. Now, how can you, on the world level, deal with questions such as books in translation without looking where you have books in English? While at this moment it seems that one of the shortcomings of translation studies is that they don't link enough the question of translation with multilingualism and with lingua franca. One does not go without the other. Business people know this very well, and the other, okay. Why is this book? Why do I start by that? Because I speak about the Bourdieu team. Casanova is one of the Bourdieu disciples. But there's a full group of scholars around Pascal Casanova, and they published in 2002, they published in the Acte de la Recherche en Sciences Sociales, which is one of the important Bourdieu journals, 2002, a special issue on translation with lots of interesting information. But it's not that you really need to remember, but the same people continue. It means there is continuity in collective research from the point of view of sociology. I'm going to indicate what they do not do and what they do, what they add. They added a lot. There are lots of things that for us are important and that are not represented. But there's much more than just that institute. In Spain, there are several groups of sociologists that develop the same kind of research. And they know the bibliography coming from translation studies, whereas the people from translation studies do not know their bibliography, which indicates that we are in, I would say, in an artificial world. Yeah. Maximum, I can even. One of the names there is, it's this one, Johan Heilbronn. He's Dutch, works in Paris. Now, read this title, Towards a Sociology of Translation, Book Translations as a Cultural Word System. You might say wonderful, La République Mondiale des Lettres by Pascal Casanova and this. So, big ambitions are not really frightening for these people. Why, after all, why not? That's their ambition. Now, what do they do? So it's about books. What kind of books? I'll show you another bibliography in a moment. We have done this kind of work years before on the history of books in France. One of the difficulties is to distinguish between disciplines and so on. Theology, business, law, economics, and, for instance, and especially religion. Everything we say about translation in general is not relevant for religion, because religion is an international system for centuries, working beyond national borderlines and so on. But from the moment we have that kind of material, now Heilbronn is a good sociologist and knows how to deal with statistics and knows how to use bibliography and electronic bibliography. Why do researchers dealing with, say, languages, literature and so on, why do they always stop on the national border? Electronic bibliographies are not linked anymore on the national borders. What Pin told us about our bibliography was, why do you stop? Now, a few years later, you say, indeed, that's nonsense. But if you work on the Middle Ages, you have to use similar principles. This is, of course, not, well, what these people do not do is analyzing discourse in these books. So the combination of the bibliographical data with the question of discourse. So how can we claim to deal with translation studies and communication if we do not combine the question of book distribution with the question of language, discourse, selection, and so on, the fact that they identify translations or not. Now, but this is a full movement. The second group I would like to mention, and then I come to one of the things we did at the work, and I stop. One of the most important groups worldwide was the group at Göttingen. They produced something like 30 books on the history of translation from the 18th century up to the 20th in Germany. Now, I told you how important Germany is in matters of translation and translation culture. So this is very important, and it shows how collective work. I'm not going to give any further analysis of what they did and what they did not. All the research we have started, in fact, we have started it in a rather traditional way on the question of translation in France between, well, say, between 1800 and 1850. One of our younger colleagues, Catherine van Bracht, produced, one of the remarkable other things is Turkey is a remarkable country for this, and this is a remarkable work along similar lines. Very complex, excellent work by Senyas Tahir. The name was not Senyas Tahir, but there was a full group there. But I wanted to say two words about Catherine van Bracht. This is an analysis of the official French bibliography. Bibliographie de la France. It exists since 1810, 1811. It's an analysis of 12,000 to 13,000 books, not only of the bibliographical references, but with all the parameters, so with a system of key information. For instance, what kind of links do we have between the language, the book series, the format of the book, the identification of translators, and so on, with a rather, so more than 40 parameters, which means, after all, that this is an interactive bibliography. I don't believe there's anything like that. No further. At this moment, the French National Library is continuing this until 1915, but they reduce it to literature. In this bibliography, it's really about everything, and one of the most important, among the important conclusions was in 1830, when everyone supposes that French Romanticism is flourishing, the most important foreign language in translation is Latin. Another important result is almost all the rules of the game that you apply to the book production. For instance, distinction between province, capital, and all the rest, all this does not work for religion. So religion is another word in France during these years. I do not want to show that the future of historiography is in statistics only. It's in a new kind of statistics, better combined with questions such as this called corpus linguistics. It's so obvious that you can easily combine that with this. What is needed is a better conceptualization of the question we ask to the reading public, to translators, and so on. But okay, I stop here. There's so much more. I'll send the documentation and an explicit summary to John Milton, and you will find that. And this refers to lots of publications. I just wanted to show how translation studies is in a full movement. But one of the crises, well, small crisis, is the discovery that translation studies is too much into inbreeding and not enough into interdisciplinarity.